Hello to all you thinkers out there, and welcome to another one of my thoughts videos. Just recently I heard that the WHO, the World Health Organization, has done a partnership with YouTube to start declaring who are accredited and respected and valid medical people and who are not. They get to control the narrative, and so I thought I'd better get in with this one before I'm not able to. I had been preparing this sort of thing for about a month now, just researching and going over all my notes and things to get it into a proper order in my brain before sharing it with you. And so it sort of brought it forward, so I may be a little bit, clunky in my delivery, and I may have to read quite a bit as well. The purpose of what I was going to do this video was to give you an update as to the how we got into this mess that we're in to do with this shamanistic sort of philosophy that has created world lockdowns and everything. Now, I did at one stage give a very quick history of what I had found up until then, and then I went back to my notes to take a look. Now, as I have stated in other videos, the process of knowledge, understanding, wisdom is in process here. It's difficult for us ordinary people to come by the knowledge to be able to understand it, to then apply it into wisdom. And so it's taken quite a bit to dig up this material. However, it is material that is commonly put forward in, even in Wikipedia you can find this stuff. However, Wikipedia, I would only trust between 50 to 7% of it, and some of the information that I checked up was very much in conflict with itself. People who were all sorts of, errors and things, and conflicting dates and stuff like that. So once again, Wikipedia is actually a popular opinion. It's not necessarily fact, but it is a reasonably big library of common opinion, and so according to the opinion of the people, this information that I was able to put together is what most people think is there, and some of it I have gone through to verify with more solid and closer to the source information. Now, I have been asked by my daughter at different times to write all this down and where I got my sources from and everything, but this has been very much a research project for my own interest, and so I don't tend to write things down where I got them from and when, until I found that Wikipedia was starting to change and delete information. And so when it comes to Wikipedia, I tend to take a copy-paste with the date to see on which date this was written, because it may not be there next time I go and take a look. And some of the other sources are just hearsay or whatever, and therefore people will very easily say, oh, that's not true. However, having said all of that, our knowledge base is a little tricky to verify and come by, but what I have managed to get, you also can go and look up. Now, I've talked about concepts in the past as being those basic small building blocks of information, understanding, wisdom that we can then build on. And basically where we start with this dilemma of where we're at is that there have been some very foundational concepts which have been misinterpreted, misunderstood, and misapplied, or applied incorrectly. This dilemma actually starts way back in the Greek times, 2,500 years ago. Plato, he criticized the doctors of his time for treating the symptoms and not the soul. But Socrates, who was around at the time, said that religion was having a negative impact on medicine, and he suggested getting rid of the spiritual side of things, getting rid of God. He proposed a material cause and effect only solution, as he thought that that's the way it should be. And this is the first major error that we've made through history. there is more to things than meets the eye, and there's more than just the material that affects things. But they decided they were going to ignore that and just go with the material, and that has consequences. The Greek concept of the humours, the four humours, was then suggested as the first sort of major explanation as a material cause and effect thing. But it was abandoned by about 1650 in the Renaissance, when microscopes were invented, and this helped them to see tissues and right down to a cellular level, and they realized that no, the humours, the basic theory of humours was that there were four basic liquids within the body that, if they mixed together, made some poison and made you unwell. But then when they had microscopes, they noticed that the individual organs and tissues would get sick or get ill without any of this humours thing, so it was abandoned. Now by 1665, the English scientist Robert Hooke made studies of these very small things down to the cellular level and coined the term cell, and this is where cellular biology came in the Renaissance. And then when we got up to about 1850, the 1850s, 1858, was Rudolf Virchow, a German physician, who then wrote down, basically summed up all of their understanding into the a cellular pathology piece that he wrote in 1858, and his one main contribution or foundation of all of this was all cells come from cells, and that's okay. And he was the first to describe a whole huge list of diseases and infirmities and different bits and pieces. Now by the time you got to Louis Pasteur, he was around at the same time in the from 1822 to 1895, so he was around at the time Virchow was, and he also agreed with that there were cells and things. But even though he was convinced of germ theory, but he could not find a causative agent for rabies, which he was particularly looking for. Now, in Pasteur's days, and a long time after his death, the word virus came into use. The first one to really use it was Adolf Meyer, who was in 1876. He was studying an infectious disease called the tobacco mosaic disease. Now the thing was that he didn't use, this is where the term virus came into history, 1876. He said that the disease was probably caused by either a toxin or a very small bacterium. Now about this time the Chamberlain filter was made, which is a ceramic filter which has got pores small enough to filter out bacteria, and so they could filter this liquid that he crushed up, got the liquid from the infected plants, filtered out the bacteria, and found that that liquid could infect other plants. And that's fair enough. He didn't know what it was. He thought it was some toxin or a small bacterium. Now later on, about 6 or 10 years, in 1886 I think it was, no, 1892 actually, so that's a little while, like 12 years or 6 or 12, a Russian biologist called Dmitry Ivanovsky, he repeated the experiments of Meyer using a filter, and he concluded the same, that it was either a toxin, but that not just the same, he felt that the toxin was produced by bacteria, and by filtering out the bacteria, the toxin that the bacteria was able to make was then filtered through into the liquid that could then make something sick. Now, once they had this thought, they were not declaring that there was a virus, they were just saying there was a toxin. Now they found that many bacteriologists from 1896 and onwards started to find a lot of bacterial causes for diseases, but anything that they could not find a bacterial cause for, they called virus. And the word virus basically means a toxic, an unknown toxic agent. Now back then that definition was quite adequate, because a toxic anything that would cause disease came under that category. And so back then the term virus was a reasonable term to use. It just meant anything infectious that we don't know what it is. Now that up until then was being fairly honest. The mosaic disease, tobacco mosaic disease, they called a virus because in those days virus meant toxic something that we don't know what it is, and so they were sort of honest and accurate. And when the first sickness to be labelled virus was the yellow fever virus, what they called virus, because then it was the unknown agent. All they knew was that a mosquito could transfer something to make people sick. Now the crazy part is that from here things start to get very muddled. Back in those Greek times they made the mistake of not recognizing what is not seen and trying to explain everything from a material cause and effect point of view. Up until now they're reasonably honest and saying, oh look, we've got cells, look, we've got some toxic stuff, oh look, we've got bacteria can do damage, and that's true. They also can produce toxins that can do damage, and they were reasonably honest up until then. But when they started to go askew is that when they found the supposed yellow fever sickness, they called it a virus, and later on tried to make a vaccine for it. Now that in itself is absolute craziness. How can you create a vaccine for something that you literally do not know what it is? That was the yellow fever vaccine created later on in the 20th century. So the first major concept that was very deficient was that material cause and effect. That actually doesn't cover everything, because there's more than just cause and effect materially, because as we now know there's a lot of stuff that's not material. So they were wrong on that one, or deficient on it. Now the next concept that they were deficient on was that fight between the liquid humours and a particle or germ theory. Now the humours was that liquids were mixing, they were toxic, or liquids that when they mixed they became toxic and made you ill. Now with the finding of cells and bacteria, germ theory was formed, and that's a concept that is also suspect. Germ theory basically says that there are particles or germs, cells, bacteria that are out to get us. Now that is very deficient, a deficient concept, because there are many causes that can make you ill that are not particles, that are not bacteria, that are not cells or germs. There is also, at the time germ theory was being slugged out, back in the late 1880, 90s, they did not, some were saying when bacteria were discovered, were saying that any damage bacteria did was because our body and system was out of balance and gave the bacteria an advantage over us. The germ theorists said, no. Bacteria have a definite agenda to get us and kill us. Now that concept is not a good concept, or it's a deficient concept also. The humours was wrong, but the system of germs being out to get us is also deficient. We now know that we live with at least 11,000 kinds of bacteria on and in our body. Inside us we are actually outnumbered 10 to 1. For every cell that we have, there are 10 bacteria in us, in our gut and inside of us. And many of those are symbiotic. We actually need those bacteria to survive. And so to say that bacteria are out to get us, that germs are out to kill us, is a deficient concept. So material only cause and effect is deficient, and germ theory is deficient. And that deficiency meant that by 1898 there was a Frenchman, I think Bergenic, he was a Dutch, sorry, Martinus Bergenic, 1851 to 1931. He was a microbiologist. He thought that he wanted to resuscitate the humours idea, but there were others like Wendell Meredith Stanley who in America who managed to convince everybody that the supposed unknown infectious agent was actually germs, when this was not true. This is where we start taking the off-ramp from the highway. By 1898, Friedrich Loeffler and Paul Frosch had also wrongly attributed or thought they'd found the answer for foot and mouth disease by doing all this filtering thing, not recognizing that what was in the filtrate was probably just some toxin, probably produced by a bacteria or from the ambience, or some other cause that we still don't know what it is. Now by the early 20th century, we're just looking for it here, they found that these things, Felix de Elieu, a French guy, Felix someone, found bacteriophages. Now this is where we really had a wall in the misconstrued concepts. The concept of germ theory, that germs are out to get us, and that there must be something really small in that filtrate other than just a toxin or some other cause like electromagnetism or who knows what, that they now had a biased search on their mind to try and find these things. They found that in some experiments that they found these things called bacteriophages. They found that if they had a bacteria in an isolated situation and things got tough, the bacteria would lay or make spores. That's sort of like eggs. They lay eggs. And then they also noticed that as the things got worse, there were these millions of little particles that they found. And by 1931, when the electron microscope was invented, they were able to see these little particles. Now, this became a very major wrong turn in history. They're now looking for particles that are doing us harm. And they had this focused intent to try and find the culprit. And these little particles, they said, we've found them. And they labeled these things, oh, we've found the virus. And the meaning of virus changed from anything, any infectious agent that's not a bacteria, to these little particles. And there was a major error, wrong turn in history. And by 1931, they had cemented that wrong turn. What they were actually doing and have found since, and they have found that these bacteriophages not only happen in bacteria, but they also happen in algae as well. Algae, when situations get disastrous or difficult, they make spores. And then when the situation is too difficult for their eggs, there's bacteria and or algae's eggs, spores, to survive, those spores will also in turn create eggs, spores, and those are the bacteriophages. Now, it was a case of mistaken identity, that they were saying, and they wrongly concluded, that the bacteriophages were killing the bacteria. But they've since proven and done their experiments again in later years to find that the very experiment itself was killing the bacteria, producing the spores, and then the spores creating the bacteriophages. It was a case of mistaken identity. Now, because now by the 1930s, and I have a few pages of stuff in between that, the electron microscope 1931 by German engineers, and they started to supposedly grow these bacteriophages in fertilized chicken eggs. That in itself as a concept is craziness as well, because we know that from what they tell us of the supposed coronaviruses and things, is that they need human cells to replicate, so you can't replicate them in eggs. They also did experiments where they made vaccines by boiling, I think the supposed polio vaccine. They found some particles which they, as a case of mistaken identity, labelled the polio virus when there was no virus. And the proof that there was no virus, and I could give you the dates, but I'm starting to get lost in my notes, I'll go by memory here, they isolated what they thought was the polio virus and boiled them for 2 hours to attenuate them or make them useless so that you could be injected by them and your body would know what to do with them. And another one, they heated them to 140 degrees Celsius to do that. But we now know that that these particles are very sensitive to heat, and they would have destroyed any supposed virus that was there. So their very vaccine processes totally destroy the very theory of the virus that they say exists. What they did from the 30s and onwards, and we'll jump a whole bunch of information, they started from this biased, wrong concept of germ theory, particles are out to get us, with a bias for finding a particle, leading them to then mistaken identity, to mistakenly identify bacteriophages as viruses rather than spores of bacteria, and then started investigating them and finding what they were made of. Now, when you have a wrong conceptual basis for all of your experimentation, you're going to get very, very skewed information. Yes, they start to find out that they are this protein there, that there's DNA maybe, and all this sort of thing. But it's the case of the fireman at the fire trying to put the fire out is the one that supposedly causes the fire. All firemen and fire engines cause fires because they're always at the fire, the house fire, when the house burns down. And it's like that. It's mistaken identity. By 1985, they'd invented another microscope when they found another kind of particle that is the human exosome, and they started to study that. Now, the mistaken identities from, first off, way back in 1879, saying there is an unknown infectious agent, and let's call it virus. The word virus was then was hijacked by the germ theory, saying that germs are out to get us, which is wrong theory, because they may or may not be out to get us. And we live successfully with a lot of bacteria, so that proves it's not true. And because they were looking for particles, that led them to a case of mistaken identity. They were also not able to figure out that if something is so small you can't see it, then there might be thousands or millions of different possibilities rather than just some isolated very low number kinds of virus. There might be millions of different kinds of unseeable but physical things. So they have made mistaken identity with bacteriophages from algae, and now exosomes in human beings and exosomes in animals, and they've now found exosomes in the plants. So there are at least those 4 or 5 categories of small particles, smaller than bacteria, that can be filtered out, and they never really gave full credit to just the fact of toxin, a poison, a chemical, a compound that a bacteria or any of those particles can produce that may be detrimental to us. They also won't recognize things like electromagnetic fields, electricity, and things that may mess with our electrical system. So I could go on for hours about each individual point here. I've got pages and pages of these notes, but that's the basic foundation of where we went wrong. First, taking God out of the picture, that's number one, and saying everything's just material when there are many things that are not material that affect us. Secondly, once they found this toxins and were able to filter out, germ theory replaced the humus theory, and germs, they were on a witch hunt for a particle of some description that was out to get us, and then successfully mistakenly identified the wrong culprit. And then they started to study that culprit, found out lots of information, and the more information they found out about this culprit, like they found out lots of information about firemen. They wear fire hats, they go in trucks, they breathe, they eat, they pee, and they do all sorts of things. So they've accumulated a big mountain of supposed information when they've got the wrong person, as it were. They've got the wrong identity. Now, they then willy-nilly through the 20th century labelled everything virus because they could never find out what they are. Yellow fever, supposedly, they made this vaccine by boiling it, which will technically destroy any virus that's there, or any particles that are there anyway. And they said that it disappeared, but oh, lo and behold, hepatitis A, B, C, D, and E appeared after that. Before that, it was almost unknown, and after that, it was known. And oh my goodness, it's got exactly the same symptoms. Is it possible that they never really found out a cure for yellow fever and just renamed it hepatitis? And go through all of the diseases. They said, oh, it's the 1918 and 1920 virus that killed over 50 million people. They eventually found it was a bacteria. And every single one of these diseases, when they say virus, they're admitting, as the first definition indicated, they have absolutely no idea what it is. Yet they try and sell you vaccines and medicines and all sorts of things for something that they have no idea what they are, and are trying to combat a mistaken identity. And that is basically how, over 150 to 200 years, well, it's about 180 years, why we're in the predicament we are, why they continue to lock us down and inject us with stuff for something that actually doesn't exist. And when I say to people, viruses don't exist, they look at me like crazy, and I say, no, it's true. It's a concept. They don't even exist in concept because they have had a case of mistaken identity, mislabeling, and misunderstanding of the whole deal. And I won't even get into the genetics, because that's the next one, where they try and prove the existence of these things when the whole thing is suspect also. But that is for another video.